Hello, this is Turbodog702. This is Castlevania Lords of Shadow. This is going to be a submission for New Game Plus non-full power mode. I'll talk a little bit about full power during this, but right now we're going to get right into this. This is the Steam version of the game. You'll see that it's the Ultimate Edition with 14 chapters, but we're going to only be doing 12 as those are the non-DLC ones. In the first stage, this is just very basic combat here. We're seeing use of the silver daggers against the lesser lycans. I'll talk a little bit about sub-weapons in a moment, but for now we're getting into the first boss encounter, which is the greater lycanthrope, the warg. For this particular one, we're going to use the flame tornado to get rid of him using shadow magic. It's a relatively quick fight. This is going to trigger a cutscene that we can't skip, that is going to introduce us to kind of interacting with stage damaging items. In this case, you need to use this pull in order to kill the warg, or else it will regenerate all of its health. We're going to be coming into the second stage here, the hunting path. This is going to be an introduction to kind of like an auto-scroller style of section. The main goal here is we're going to have QTE events that pop up, but instead of completing them, we are going to fail them on purpose. At the end of this section, if you did all the QTEs and fought off the wargs correctly, you would still be knocked off, so by falling off immediately, we save a little bit of time. The reason I'm using the silver daggers is, unlike many Castlevania games, this game has kind of like, almost like a rock, paper, scissors system when it comes to fighting opponents. Lesser lycanthropes are weak against silver. In fact, all lycanthropes are. So by throwing a single silver dagger, I can actually kill them immediately. You'll see different other types of weaknesses throughout this run. This is Ultimate Light. This is the strongest light move in the game, and actually the best DPS move in the game if you get an enemy in a corner. Typically, Ultimate Light will push enemies away, which is what makes it a little bit weaker than Ultimate Shadow. But if you can catch someone in the corner, the amount of damage it does and the speed it does it is a decent amount better than Ultimate Shadow. So here we're seeing the sprint shoes use the cyclone boots and a little bit of double jumping. And here we're going to see our first instance of backwards long jumping, or backwards high jumping, whatever you want to call it. By doing that extended jump and this one, we are bypassing cutscenes and invisible walls. So the first one is to cut out a cutscene which would spawn enemies. And the second one is to get over an invisible wall that disappears when you defeat the arena. You're going to see that this is a very common theme in this game, and really all 3D spectacle games or epic action games, whatever you want to call them. Right here we're going to be doing a relatively new strat. This is a super jump using Ultimate Shadow. So the intended path here is to use a goblin grenade to blow up the tree. If I didn't have enough shadow magic to do the ultimate shadow, then I definitely would have used that strategy. But since I had a shot at it, I decided to use ultimate shadow to try and initiate the super jump, and it worked out just fine. That saves about 10 seconds over the intended strat, which is using grenades to blow up a tree to make a bridge. So here we're introduced to the hook tip, which allows us to grapple. Since this is New Game Plus, we already have access to all of these. This is the next boss fight. This is with a swamp troll. But we're actually just going to jump out of the arena using a high jump and kind of progress with the level. Made a slight error here in stomping to the ground a little bit early, but I was able to get out just fine afterward. We're going to see a little bit of a climbing skip here. Normally you're intended to follow the lighted ledges and kind of jump all around, but with double jump we're able to kind of jump out of bounds slightly and continue on with the stage a little faster than intended. A lot of times you'll see me use an ability called the Stomp. The reason I'm using that is to get back to the ground quickly, or to initiate a standing state if I need to jump on top of something, which I'll explain a little bit more. So Pan's Temple, very straightforward stage. This is a simple puzzle. Since I already know the solution, I don't need to pick up the puzzle pieces. And towards the end of the stage, we're going to see a very classic kind of survival horror puzzle. I like to call it kind of the rotating rings puzzle, where you have 3 rings. The rings adjacent to the ring you interact with will move the opposite way, and you just need to solve the puzzle for making a bridge. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So sprinting is our fastest normal form of movement. However, you can only sprint for about 7 steps before you need to refresh it by pressing the buttons again. I try to jump whenever I don't need a huge amount of cornering or control, because jumping seems to preserve momentum perfectly or close enough to it that it's the most optimal form of movement. Your double jump is pretty nice for a burst of movement, but the problem is there's kind of a startup to it. But it can be useful in certain situations to get a little bit of extra room when jumping into a cutscene or something like that. So many of the cutscenes in this game can be skipped, which is both good and bad. It's mostly good because it cuts down the length of this run considerably, especially compared to the other games in the series. The unfortunate part is you do miss out on a lot of the really, really crisp cinematics in this game. But I'm willing to make that concession for a little bit of speed. The ones that you can't skip, it's a little bit unfortunate, but most of them aren't too long. Most of the times when you can't skip something, it's due to something opening up or triggering, or you have a QTE inside of it that needs to be done. So we're going to be coming into the last section of Chapter 1, which is going to be our first Titan. It's a very strict influence on the Shadow of the Colossus series and other games of that ilk. It's kind of talked about in bad tones when other people discuss this game. But basically we need to take down this Titan. He has weak points all over him that we need to hit in order to trigger the next phase of the fight and progress to other vital points. Pretty simple thing here. We need to dodge his hand twice. On the second one, he will smash it into the ground, and that's going to give us our opening to make our way onto the Titan. There is a little bit of optimization when it comes to Titans, but a lot of it is kind of based on luck. As you can see, I need to hold on to him when he shakes. When the Titan decides to shake is somewhat random. There's good and bad patterns that you can get. So far, I haven't found a way to manipulate the patterns on them. The more important thing than the shakes is when the Titan decides to shake. Because, for example, right now, when I'm on this arm, his shake will try and take me off twice. There are other places where when the Titan shakes, it'll only try to knock you off once, or it'll be a much shorter animation. And that's where you really want them to shake if you had a choice. If this was a full power run where we have access to all of our resources every map, I would be using a dark crystal here to make it so that I only need to hit these ruins once. So considerably sped up in that case. But as it is now, I need to hit each of these ruins 10 times in order to progress to the next stage. So I want to give a shout out really quick while we're finishing this up to the people that really made this game runnable and playable. Shout outs to Findlestick, Akion for doing archival for the skips, Satvara, and Vipia Zone as well. All those guys did major contributions to the route. There are other people who have found small discoveries here and there, but by and large, those are the guys that have really pushed this game, in particular Findlestick and Satvara. So this is going to be the final ruin before we finish this up. And contrary to what you might think, I actually want him to swing his hand here, because it gives me an opening to get between 4 and 5 attacks. While if he just shakes his head, I can only get maybe 1 or 2. But I can kind of push the pace here to get the last couple hits and not worry about it. Unfortunately, you do have to menu all the way across all the levels when you defeat it. It's kind of an unfortunate consequence of this. We're going to be using stomps to bypass a little bit of climbing here. We're going to be rolling off of a ledge coming up here to once again kind of bypass a little bit of platforming. So normally this game has a very strict kind of invisible wall system. Sometimes it's these huge invisible walls that you can't bypass, And other times it's just little lips that keep you from falling off if you're casually playing, making a bad jump. I'm refilling my magic here because even though we don't need the magic now, the magic fonts allow me to fill it up here, so I figure it's nice to do it sooner rather than later. So a lot of the times I'll do a roll here against these werewolves. The reason for that is the roll can kind of stagger them, and those guys have a habit of swinging at you whenever they get close. We're going to bypass pulling down that tree to make a platform. Because we have double jump, the early part of the game is going to get vastly broken simply on double jump itself with basic platforming. But we are still going to need to do high jumps and break invisible walls and go out of bounds to do certain skips, such as this. So here we're attempting to get on top of the wall and then jump off into the arena but out of bounds. This will allow us to run around the outside of the arena. The outsides of these walls are not collision modeled, so we can actually walk through them. Something to note is that in a lot of places there is no floor like here. And because of that, it's important that we do very structured long jumps in order to bypass these gaps so we don't fall infinitely into nothing. If we did mess it up, then it would mean restarting from checkpoint, which would cost us a little bit of time. That is kind of one of the nice things about running this game, is it has a very structured level system, so we don't need to worry about game-breaking hard locks or soft locks, and even if you did get in a position where you were soft locked, you could restart from checkpoint, and the checkpoints are pretty decent in this game. Here we're fighting spiders, but most of the combat inside of this is going to be heavily dominated by the use of magical things such as Ultimate Light and Ultimate Shadow, and the weaknesses through sub-weapons. So the combat isn't the real draw in this category, or inside of full power. The real draw of this is seeing the crazy sequence breaks and out of bounds inside of it. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to appreciate that from a casual perspective if you haven't played the game or haven't played it for some time, but I'll try to do my best to explain that to people when I do runs for other marathons and such. So this is a slight platforming skip. I get a little bit of a bad jump on the first one. I try to salvage it, but don't quite make it. These web bridges, you're seeing me jump across them. You have to do a balance beam on them if you don't do that. So it's a little bit slower. The jumps are a little bit more precise than you might think, because there's only openings where you start the web and end the web, so you can't just jump the gap. We're going to do an out of bounds here. Normally you're intended to get a pair of keys for the door in the background there, but by getting out of bounds we can do a tight jump to get on the other side here, out of bounds. We then get on top of the mausoleum roof here, slide over to the side so that we can get in a standing state, and that'll allow us to jump again and get into the trigger right here. That's going to give us our spike chain. That just allows us to rip down pillars like this one and kind of continue on with the game. Very simple progression tools. So you're going to start to see a theme here, as I mentioned, with other action platformers and spectacle action games, where these games tend to fall apart when you can get about 2 to 3 times the height or length that you would normally need inside of a stage with a jump. At that point, you can usually get over invisible walls, do jumps that shouldn't be possible, things of that nature. This is Ultimate Shadow. This is the hardest single-hitting move inside of the game, but as you see, it kind of does a little bit of slowdown when you do it. So that is why Ultimate Light out-damages it if you can drag an enemy to a corner. We're using a boar here in order to smash into the wall. You need 2 charges here. I went for something that I call the glitched boar charge, or glitch charge. You can initiate what I think is a glitch, where if you charge close to the door, sometimes the boar will treat it as though you had a running start and smash the barrier on its own. Really sweet out of bounds coming up here. This is going to get rid of the vast majority of the level. We're going to get out of bounds, fall out of bounds, and kind of take a lower route that's very open here to get to the final arena. Since we're not approaching the arena from the front, the trigger never activates here, but we do need to make a precise high jump here to make it back in bounds. So we're going to get on this ledge and then use a jumping move called Guillotine. Guillotine has a special property where if you catch certain pieces of geometry, you can almost stick to them and then relaunch. This is going to be useful in a couple of stages, including here. It is also particularly useful in the implementation of an infinite jump that was recently discovered. Infinite jumps' best uses are in a new game run, which because of that kind of becomes a viable option. But because of the difficulty of the infinite jump, I have not been able to implement it as of yet. But I have been working on it. It was originally found on console versions. Consoles run at a very slower frame rate, and it's on an older version of the game, so the mechanics behind it might have changed slightly when transitioning to PC. The PC version comes pre-patched. Console versions, you can obviously just pop in the disc, get rid of patches if you need to, which does get rid of 1 or 2 skips, which I'll cover a little later as we come to them. This is Waterfalls of Icarta. We're using the stomp to stand on this statue. That gives us the additional height that we need to make this high jump and slam on top of this invisible wall. We're then using a jump that we preserve as we fall to land on the outside on a very tiny ledge there. By jumping into the background here, we're able to land on a ledge, and even though we triggered Death Collision, we still landed on the ledge and it checkpointed us there. From here, we need to get on top of this tunnel, and that'll give us the height we need to bypass this invisible wall and get back in bounds. This is a very, very difficult trick to learn, especially when you're first learning the game. But I'd like to think that I've gotten a fair amount of consistency with it and trained a couple backups as well. So because this is new game plus and not full power, we do need to be careful with our resources and ration them appropriately. Magic is one of those resources, but more important is holy water. We're going to do a high jump here to grab the grapple point on the opposite side of the canyon. Normally you would have to go all the way around this kind of pillar that's next to us. That bridge breaks inside of this next cutscene with a spider, but we are going to use a super jump to get over the invisible wall that blocks us from passing it. Normally you would have to use the spider to spin a web bridge, but since we have access to this pretty sweet back jump, we can just bypass the bridge normally. You could even see me balancing on a spider bridge that isn't there right now at the very end. We're going to use shadow magic to open up this door coming up here, and then we're going to do a slight platforming skip to grab a ledge out of reach. Normally these ledges are deactivated due to the fighting arena, but if we can get high enough to kind of break our combat in a way, then we can grab onto this ledge just fine. That's going to allow us to complete the stage. So I mentioned holy water. Holy water is very, very powerful against a number of enemies. But more importantly, holy water allows you to gain a pretty decent sized chunk of height during your jumps, and you can chain them together to a pretty heavy extent, about 6 holy waters total, to gain some decent height. So we will be using those in order to do certain sequence breaks. They're also very, very nice for gaining a little bit of horizontal motion as well. This is a good Harta. A NPC comes up to this wall and climbs it, and the game proclaims that it is impossible to climb here. But it turns out Gabbo Belmont knows exactly how to climb up there. So by jumping here, we bypass a invisible wall that blocks that area. But as you can see, that is an entire stage skip. You're normally meant to jump all over the place and get a bunch of steeds in order to bypass canyons, tons of other stuff, but because of high jumping and out of bounds and sequence breaking glitches, we're able to pass the whole stage in less than a minute. It's one of the fastest stages in the game, if not the fastest. This is Dark Dungeon. We're doing a little bit of platform skipping here. I mentioned the term platform skipping and ledge grab skipping. We're trying to bypass this because Gabriel is quite slow when he's kind of sliding across ledges. Even if you use the technique where you kind of hop across a ledge, which is considerably faster, it's still way, way slow to do these the intended way. Had a little bit of trouble there getting to this section, but that's okay. A little bit of ice skating up these stairs. Cyclone boots have an odd property where if you go up slopes or run into certain collision, it resets the timer on them. It's pretty consistent in a couple places. So normally you're intended to get a couple of keys and kind of send a bridge across this chasm, but since we got a good long jump, we can get on top of the invisible wall and bypass it. We're going to be seeing more platforming skips here. So we're going to jump backwards with our preserved double jump. That's going to allow us to grab this. And then we have a little arena here with some imps. We don't need to kill a certain amount, but I am going to kill some to try and get some drops. Maybe luck out a little bit. This isn't really super important one way or another, but it's just a nice place to get a little bit of extra stuff if you can. But we're waiting on a timer here. So holy water, pretty important. Very, very powerful. Daggers are mostly only used for lycanthropes, although they would have some application in the infinite jump if we were utilizing that more. Pretty soon we're going to be seeing Dark Crystal, so we'll hold off on that. And fairies are our other sub-weapon. And again, I'll kind of cover that as we run into them. Sanctuary Entrance is another very, very fast stage. This might be the fastest stage, if it's not at a Carta. Normally you're intended to take a Dark Crystal by building it in pieces, 4 pieces throughout the stage, and then returning to this place to unlock this door and then go forward and solve a puzzle. We can bypass this door. We're going to go ahead and do a little bit of farming here in these pots. Super easy to break, and they have a decent shot at dropping items, so we break a few of them. Unfortunately, didn't get much luck on them. But by bypassing this door, we can hit the end of level trigger and move on. This is the second Titan fight, and this is Dark Crystal. So what Dark Crystal does is it does an extreme amount of damage to everything on screen. For Titans, it makes it so that you can break their ruins in a single attack. So very, very powerful, very strong. So we now need an avenue to get on the Titan. With the ice one, we had to make it punch through the ice, so we had an opening. Here we are going to throw a rock back at it. That's going to kind of stagger it for us to get in. And then after that, it's just a bunch of kind of platforming. And I mentioned it in the first Titan. Very similar mechanics on this. Just hoping for reasonable luck on the shakes and just moving efficiently. So one of the benefits of full power is not having to farm. You saw me break some of those vases to try and look for holy water. I will be doing more of that as the stage continues. In fact, I will do a revisit to one stage in order to farm for holy water for the final stretch of the game. One of the nice things about full power is that it allows you to go for more aggressive strats because you don't have to worry about resources as much. You can also go for strats that you couldn't possibly budget in with a normal New Game Plus run. What full power is there is an in-game cheat that allows you to have full resources when you start a stage or restart from checkpoint. So that allows us to always have holy water, always have magic, always have whatever thing that we need in order to do it. And normally I would be against using a cheat menu inside of the game, but as mentioned, because the real draw of this game is the glitches, is the out of bounds, is the movement, and not the combat really, the combat just gets trivialized. So because of that, you're really budgeting resources in New Game Plus that just slow down the run. Like, you're not gaining anything from not using the cheat, I feel like, other than not using a cheat. And, you know, some people have a legitimacy problem with that. You know, it's up to them to decide. I've done both categories, and I feel like full power is the much more interesting one personally. So a little bit of a QTE here to finish off this Titan. You don't want to mess up this one, because if you mess up this one, it's like a minute 30 to get back in this position. You'll see the QTEs are 2 rings. When the outer ring goes into the inner ring, you can hit pretty much any normal action button in the game, and it will trigger it. I really like this system of QTE because you don't need to look for very specific ones. You don't need to worry about positioning of your QTEs or anything. It's just hit a button. That being said, it is a little bit of a shame that they had QTEs in this game, because this game has gorgeous cutscenes. And a lot of the time, especially the first times you're playing, you're spending so much time paying attention to the QTE and not dying, when you really just want to enjoy how good the game looks. This is Black Knight. Prime example of how combat gets trivialized by using magic. We do deactivate our magic before doing the prompt to rip off his armor. The reason for that is if you have magic active when you do that, he cannot spawn magical orbs for you to absorb. So you'll see me turn it off before pulling off his armor. So didn't get any luck on that one. It's pretty typical to get about 2 magic drops, but I've seen 3 and 4 before. It just depends. So because we're out of magic, we do have to spend a little bit of extra time fighting here. If we had full power, we could have used a Dark Crystal at the start of this fight to do a little bit of damage. Dark Crystal doesn't completely destroy the Black Knight, but it does do considerable damage. So we can spawn neutral elemental orbs, which are the yellow orbs, by maintaining a combo without being hit. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see kind of a yellow bar. That's our focus meter. You can build focus meter by having attack variety, parrying, and not getting hit. Once it fills up, every hit that you do spawns neutral elemental orbs that you can either absorb into light or shadow magic. So we're coming into the third stage. Third stage, we're going to get introduced to one of the things of the Dark Gauntlet, or the Black Gauntlet that we got, which is it allows us to move obstacles. We're going to break down a wall using this, and that's going to create a swing platform for us to reach the next section of the area. In the next section of the area, we're going to be picking up a Dark Crystal on the side to use for later. So talking a little bit about light and shadow magic, which is our blue and red bars at the bottom left and bottom right of the screen. Light magic allows you on hit to regain some life. So it's kind of like a lifesteal mechanic. You hit the enemy, you gain life when it's active. The shadow magic, which is the bottom right, the red bar when it fills up, is extra damage. It just does more raw extra damage with it. In addition to that, each of these has a different move set that you can get with special attacks. For example, in the early part of the game, you saw a Flame Tornado that we used against the Warg. And then I've been using Ultimate Light and Ultimate Shadow. There are a couple of other niche uses for some of the other moves, which I'll cover a little later. This is an arena skip. We are going to break some vases here before we do it in order to maybe get a little bit of holy water. So unfortunately, I hit a bad part of collision on this door and don't make it over on the first attempt. So I end up having to try again. Normally in full power, I would use 3 holy waters before doing this, but because our holy water is at a premium, I need to be very careful about how I budget it. So I do try to get over in 2 holy waters in that case. Gonna refill our magic here and bypass a combat arena here as well. Sorry, going for a couple extra drops, and I actually get relatively lucky with holy water here. I still would have been able to continue even without this. I would have just had to have kind of worked around what I was going to do, or maybe did a tiny bit more farming. So normally you're supposed to fight an arena and pull down a platform to do this skip, but we can just jump high enough to do this. The door on the other side of here is a fairy door. Normally you need 3 fairies to unlock it. Since this is New Game Plus, we already have 3 fairies. You're intended to go all around the stage collecting them from fairy fountains normally. So this is our first Lord of Shadow, Cornell. Don't blink, because this is going to be quick. We basically decide that the friendship is more important. And we decide that we're just going to let Cornell be. You know, let him work out his issues. And he's pretty pleased with this and glad that we let him do this. You know, he forgets that we're his friend also. So he decides to give us his Cyclone Boots and a piece of the God Mask and just let us be on our way. So that is a full boss skip. Just hitting the end of level trigger by bypassing the arena. Stage 4-1 is the Mountain Fortress. So we're going to be using a Shadow Charge to break down this door. It's one of the basic moves that Shadow gets. Unfortunately, we aren't able to do a slight platforming skip here. We kind of slide off of the invisible wall instead of landing on top of it. So because of that, we have to climb on this edge. And you're going to get to see a little bit how slow this is. Had I succeeded in making it on top of there, it's a potential of a 10-second skip. But I can't waste more holy water on this skip at this time. It's one of the low-impact skips. Again, if this was full power, I'd definitely be willing to go for 2 or 3 attempts at it. But since I have limited holy water quantities, I do need to budget appropriately here. Coming up, we're going to come to the Ogre skip. So normally there is a boss here called the Ogre, which is a 3-phase fight. The first phase is a small arena fighting some smaller trolls. Then you fight the Ogre's hand, and then you fight the Ogre proper. We are going to bypass that by doing a strict jump out of bounds. We have to kind of curve our jump in order to reach the out of bounds part that we need. And then land back on the backside of here on solid ground. A vast majority of this space outside of here is just fall infinitely in softlock. By doing this skip, we also bypass a trigger with a Chupacabra. Chupacabras are an encounter that's meant to be a puzzle platforming section. The Chupacabra takes away all of your relics, and you're meant to retrieve them by chasing it down and figuring out where the Chupacabra is at and how to keep him still and recover your artifacts. So unfortunately here, I get a bad jump and don't quite hit the end of level trigger. This is kind of atypical, but it can happen, and this will be a point where I have to do a restart from checkpoint, since I'm currently falling infinitely at that point. So this is one of the more punishing ones if you do miss it, unfortunately, because you have to do this whole section again. But it's not too bad. Again, you can easily kind of get this set up again. While we're speaking about this and while we're kind of recovering from this, I would mention that a huge part of this game, in addition to learning about high jumps, is figuring out how much height you need, how much distance, and kind of what collision is around you. A lot of these skips, you have no visual on Gabriel. You cannot see where he is, where he's going, anything like that. You just have to instinctively know where your guy is in position in space and work around that. You have to have an intimate knowledge of where collision is, where platforms are, where invisible walls are, and everything in between in order to do a lot of these skips. My first time running this game, it was very, very difficult because even though there was documentation to say, hey, you can do this skip, and there was videos, there was no real tutorial. So I basically had to watch Findlestick's original individual level runs and backwards engineer every single skip. This is a bypass of an arena by jumping over the gate. We're going to be bypassing a second arena with some sword masters by going into a small niche here. That niche is going to give us some additional height to be able to trigger a grapple point. Even though there's a grapple point above us, because we haven't activated it, Gabriel can't pull it. I get a bad piece of collision here, actually. But because I realized it early, I was able to do an air throw. When you air throw a small enemy, it allows you to gain an additional portion of height. So I was able to salvage that, even though I got a little bit of poor luck with collision during the jump. Normally, that is a jump that you need 0 holy water for. We managed to not use holy water this time either, but we did have to do a little bit of a recovery strat. We tried to do a little bit of a climbing skip here. We drop off and use our preserved double jump to try and grab the ledge. Unfortunately, Gabriel decided he didn't want to grab it that time. We might have been a little bit too close to the edge of it rather than towards the center. We're going to be fighting Crow Witch here. Crow Witch, you're intended to throw back her eggs at her. That is how you do enough damage to kind of get her into her damage phase. Normally, you're supposed to throw back like a single egg and do a few phases of this. But if you have decent timing and okay luck, you can throw back multiple eggs at her like this. By throwing 3 eggs, we put her in a state where we can 2-cycle her. We throw the 4th egg just so that we don't have to deal with an additional enemy. Each of those eggs, when they hit the ground, they spawn an enemy, and if there are enemies up, she will not throw additional eggs. So because of that, we want to minimize the amount of enemies that are going to be active at any given time so that we can quickly disperse of them and move on to the next phase of the fight. So we're going to do a little bit more damage to get her into her air phase again. In order to 2-cycle the Crow Witch, you need to get at least 2 eggs thrown back on her on phase 1, and then however many more you need on phase 2. And I believe it's 4 eggs total. We get a Crow Storm here, which is a little unfortunate, but she triggered that quite early, so we actually didn't lose much of any time. Because we did sufficient damage during the first phase, we only need the single egg here. We throw the second one just because we don't want the enemy that spawns to kind of get in our way. So we successfully got the omelet strat. Made ourselves a 4-egg omelet and then a 2-egg omelet. It's going to allow us to move into Chapter 5 pretty easily. So most of the skips, again, came from Fiddlestick and Satvara for this game. However, I have tried to innovate as much as I could when it comes to minimizing the amount of holy water you need for this particular category. One of the biggest innovations for this game was the understanding that you could maintain your double jump for backwards long jumps or backwards high jumps. So normally you can gain a huge amount of height by doing what's called a launcher into a double jump. A launcher is any move that can chain into a double jump from the ground. Typically they give you higher height than a normal double jump. This is a Chupacabra. It steals all my relics and I gotta hunt him down. And this is all based around that. We're going to be using fairies in a little bit. They're going to look like little green dots. Fairies can distract a huge amount of enemies. They are integral in dealing with some of the most problematic enemies, and they will be used later as a distraction to allow us to bypass certain switches without fighting arenas. But for now, we're going to use them to kind of distract foes while we get hold of a boar. That'll be kind of how that stage develops. So returning to the concept of preserving your double jump. So it was discovered that when you double jump backwards, you have no speed cap. So because of that, when I say like a backwards long jump or a backwards high jump, what going backwards with your double jump does is it moves you at very high velocity against whatever wall you're going against, which can sometimes allow you to do skips by kind of like, I hesitate to say zipping, but you slide so quickly against possible slopes on an invisible wall that the game just gives it to you, kind of, like you slide over them. It is also very, very good for positional advantage. Previously, sometimes we would have to use excessive amount of holy water and a very precise jump to make certain sequence breaks. And since Holy Water only gives you a small amount of horizontal motion, you'd have to blow like 5, 6, 7, 8 Holy Waters on a single trick just to get enough horizontal motion to do a sequence break. With backwards long jumping, since you gain such a huge amount of horizontal distance with that second jump, you can turn those like 4 to 6 Holy Water skips into 2 or less. It is such a powerful technique, and I really credit this technique with the ability of this game to be able to be run RTA. The work that Fiddlestick and Satvara had done was mainly focused around individual levels and just seeing what was possible in the game rather than running this in an RTA fashion. As of this point, Lestat, Vampire, and I are the only two to run this game RTA that I'm aware of. I feel comfortable in saying that I'm probably the best RTA player inside of the world right now. The only person that I think might be better might be Fiddlestick. Just talking with him a little bit and kind of picking his brain about certain things, he very well might be able to do a lot of the stuff he does in his IL runs in an actual run. But since he seems more focused on glitch hunting and doing individual levels, I don't know if we're ever going to see him kind of put together a run in that capacity. But I welcome it. I'd love to see what he's able to do with the game in an RTA. But for now, at least, I guess I'm king of the empty throne, right? I love how I just skipped over the fact that we went out of bounds in Weigal. Weigal Village is a really quick stage as well. You get out of bounds, hit the end of level trigger, and that's how that works. Here we're using a couple high jumps to bypass some barriers. Normally you would need to get some keys and switches to get past them. But since all 3 of these gates are relatively short, we are able to bypass them quite quickly and make our way to the next level. There is a faster way to do this level involving doing an out-of-bounds jump off of the first gate, but it's more for full power since it does use a Holy Water or 2. I also wanted the opportunity to farm these barrels for possible drops, so I decided to use this strategy. Abbey Library. So this is one of my favorite stages in the game. It might even be my favorite, because you get to see a little look at the design of this game. So anybody that's been in game design or seen game dev stuff is probably chuckling a little bit at that out-of-bounds look at the backwards textures. So we're going to go inbounds here in order to farm some resources. There is a potential skip you could do to bypass this puzzle and the door that opens. It is a little bit risky, though, and it doesn't save a huge amount of time, but the far more important thing here is I want to try to farm resources. So even though I have full Holy Water here, there are a couple stages where fairies actually become important, so I really want the fairies here. I want full Holy Water, but since I already have that, I really want to get at least like 6 fairies, and I believe I get 8 at the end of this, which is good. We will later revisit this stage because Abbey Library is very quick to complete once you've done what you want to do. And you can see just the huge amount of breakables here make this a great place to farm if you need extra resources. There's even a magic font later in the level, so if we needed magic for some reason, then we could farm that as well, but that isn't really needed. So you're seeing us doing this running kind of spin whip into presenting the combat cross. That's kind of the fastest way to break things in the game. We're going to do a high jump here to bypass this wall that blocks off the end of level trigger. Normally there's a light puzzle that you have to solve with reflecting lights. Abbey Tower. So you are able to jump across this moat using a high jump, but then you have to do a bunch of structured jumps in order to get back in bounds. It is a little quicker than what I'm doing here, but again, this gives me a small opportunity to farm. And it, again, doesn't save too much time, even when you optimally do it compared to this strat. If we had full power, we could unleash light-charged fairies, which would create kind of like landmines for these imps. Since we don't have that, we're going to use daggers, since daggers are largely going to be ineffective for most of the run after here. Using a Shadow Charge Dagger makes kind of like a bomb, and those kill imps in a single attack. We jump up here in order to hit a checkpoint, and then restart from that checkpoint. That allows us to despawn the imps. If we didn't despawn the imps and tried to do this platforming section, they'd be knocking us off all over the place. So very important that we do that. So you're seeing that these ledges are kind of breaking behind us, but we know exactly where we're going, so it's not a big deal. So you've heard me say things like preserving my double jump. So while I'm preserving my double jump for backwards long jumps and backwards high jumps, I usually use that as a term for preserving your double jump during a platforming section like this. What happens is that in most cases, when you're done swinging on your combat cross or when you first jump on a ledge, you have a stored double jump because you haven't used it yet. So you are then allowed to do a single double jump when you come off of a ledge and attempt to do something with it in the prospect of the speed run, which I'll kind of point out a couple places where I use it. If you fail that, then you don't get your double jump back. So then you either need to do something to get it back, or you just have to forgo the skip. So this is going to be Bronner, simple combat section. We're going to go ahead and refill our magic here, because there's an extensive combat arena here to get past. If we had full power, we could spam Holy Waters here, but since we do not have full power, we need to budget our Holy Waters to only use a few in this fight. So Holy Water will bring vampires into a throw killable state, but we don't want to throw kill them because it's quite slow. You could throw a second Holy Water to kill them outright if you wanted to, but again, we need to kind of maintain our Holy Water count, so we're being a little judicious with it, using Ultimate Light here and there. We've overcharged our magic to get a second full bar, which is going to help us maintain our magic count near the end of this level. Once we get into the fight with Bronner, it's going to be abusing Ultimate Shadow in order to push him into the corners and deal damage. But relatively simple here. So our Holy Water and Fairy count is looking pretty darn good going into the next chapters of the game, which I'm pretty pleased with. It's kind of a shame that you don't get to see a lot of the really cool boss kill animations in this game, but again, concessions for speed. So a funny kind of thing when it comes to vampires as well is they appear in kind of a blood mist before they spawn. If you hit the blood mist with a Holy Water, it instantly kills them. This is, again, more useful in full power mode, since you can use Holy Water however you want. In this, I kind of have to let them spawn so that I can get groups of them hit with the Holy Water, rather than maybe only killing one or two. Castle Sewers is another relatively fast stage. You're meant to pull a crank to open up a gate. During that, you fight some skeletons that reanimate. Skeletons are kind of annoying inside of this stage, but then you're supposed to solve a puzzle to bypass a gate. For this, we use a skip that allows us to hit the end of level trigger by standing on some invisible wall collision. If I didn't have enough Holy Water, I've actually developed a strat that uses 0 Holy Water that would allow me to do that skip as well, but it's a little slower. There's an example of that preserved double jump that allowed us to jump backwards and bypass a balancing beam that we'd normally call across. This is a cache of the Holy Order. This particular cache has Holy Water. Other caches might have daggers or... yeah, it's daggers and Holy Waters for those ones. And then there's fairy fountains that allow you to get fairies. Dark crystals, there's kind of deposits. By jumping out of bounds and jumping underneath the level, we trigger a checkpoint in a tunnel underneath the stage. We restart from checkpoint there, which refreshes our double jump and allows us to jump out of that arena as we're falling. Here we're going to go up to this crank and crank. If we were worried these bones animate into skeletons, we could release some fairies to distract them. However, with extensive testing, as long as you get here quickly and get to the crank quickly, you are able to pull it 4 times, which is all you need in order to progress the level. If I was ever worried, or if I was doing full power, I would use the fairies as I was cranking the lever to distract the enemies and give me more safety.
It seems getting into the
Maze Gardens. So Maze Gardens has kind of a rough skip in it as well. I mentioned Waterfalls of Ikharta was one of the hardest skips in the game to learn. Ogre Skip was another very, very difficult one when I was first starting out. This one was pretty brutal as well, until I started to realize some commonalities in how the skip worked. So we're going to use the statue right next to us to gain additional height. Unfortunately, when we stomp down there, it put us in a constant falling state. When you're like that on a breakable object, it'll just break the object. So instead, we have to stomp down and immediately launch off of it. If we didn't launch immediately out of the stomp, the game would count us in a floating state and break the platform. But using that little bit of extra height, we're able to gain enough height to jump over an enormous invisible wall and hit this puzzle. This bypasses us getting a spider and making a web bridge. However, after getting the key, we do need to restart from checkpoint, because the invisible wall is still there. By restarting from checkpoint, we despawn the invisible wall, and it gives us our web bridge that we never made in order to get back here. We still need to gain access to the spider. The spider is going to allow us to use its strength and its web in order to break a gate a little bit later in the level. And that's going to kind of complete up this level. One of the nice things is this leads back to the castle courtyard, which is where that holy water stash was. So you get 2 opportunities to pick up holy water, which is pretty nice. It'll maybe not cap out your holy water, but it'll get it close. You know, you'll end up with like 7-8 holy waters by the end of this. That's why we aren't too concerned about spending 2 holy waters to do the puzzle skip inside Maze Garden. So we're going to be making our way into the castle proper. We already dealt with the Lycan Dark Lord, Cornell. Right now we are infiltrating the castle, which will later become Castlevania. This has the Vampire Queen Carmilla, who holds another piece of the God Mask. I'm trying not to talk too much about the story, but I'm trying to give a little bit of context with the game, but I would definitely discuss that a little bit more inside of a marathon itself. You can only talk so much mechanics here and there. So here we are using some fairies in order to distract the vampires behind us while we crank this gate. Unlike the skeleton gate, which only took 4 cranks, this takes 7. So because it takes so much, we actually need to send out 2 sets of fairies in order to distract the vampires long enough for us to get through this gate. After this, we are going to be doing a high jump to get over this door and its invisible barrier collision. We run into a little bit of trouble with this one. Even though we use 3 holy water, which you can get over this gate with 2 on a very tight jump, so 3 shouldn't have been any trouble, but unfortunately we just had a little bit of bad luck when it came to collision. We didn't quite slide over that. I thought about restarting from checkpoint, but I decided to try and guts it out. My holy water was still pretty strong at this point. I had had relatively good luck throughout, and I had worked on enough strategies to minimize holy water usage that I felt okay with this. So this time I was able to get over the fence. If you don't go far enough, you actually trigger a minigame with a chess piece thing. You can skip that with the in-game UI, but we don't want to have to go through skipping cutscenes for that. That skip skips over fighting a large amount of very difficult enemies. It skips fighting a couple of arenas. Just in general is a very, very powerful skip for Castle Hall. Here we're trying to farm a little bit of holy water because, again, I was feeling a little dicey because I had to spend so much holy water on that, so I wanted to try to farm a little bit. Funny enough, unfortunately, I didn't break that candelabra on the ground my first try. Because that actually ends up dropping a holy water, embarrassingly here. But I've already started my high jump here to stand on this lance. By standing on that lance, we are able to get enough height to jump out of bounds here. We jump around this door to initiate a checkpoint. After we hit that checkpoint, we restart from checkpoint in order to get put back in bounds. After that, we are going to be opening up some of those elementally charged locks on doors. There's a specific pattern to this. For this one, for example, it's light, light, shadow, shadow, light, shadow. After the fourth one, we are going to be somewhat beset by skeletons. So because of that, I'm going to release some fairies here in order to distract them. Very important that I activate the fairies either with shadow magic on or with no magic on. If I activate them with light magic on, then the fairies become kind of like explosives that go towards targets and blow up rather than distracting. So once again, just breaking a couple things, trying to get a little lucky on holy water. So I mean, this was a mix of good and bad luck throughout the run, but this is still a really, really solid time. It's kind of hard to understate how difficult this game is. I've run quite a few games, and even some of them I've put enough time in to become pretty darn good at them. And this is definitely the hardest game that I've had to learn. A large portion because, as I mentioned, I had to backwards engineer the skips. And because you can't see Gabriel, I had to work a lot on visual cues when the skip was starting, and then a lot of audio cues. And then just kind of try to piece it together myself. But it's been very rewarding to kind of push this game as much as I've been able to at this point. And I look forward to pushing it more using the infinite jump for some of the stronger applications. So we're going to bypass this fence. Bypassing this fence allows us to skip going into a small arena to get some keys to open it. By jumping out of bounds here and around the outside of this stage, we also bypass having to do a drop ball puzzle. So Electric Laboratory. Electric Laboratory is another really, really rough stage to optimize and get correct. Once again, only at 3 holy water here, so I'm breaking some. I actually get some decent drops on here. 5 holy water I feel pretty good about at this point for what I have available and what I need to do. I will be using 3 holy water in this stage itself. So I know I needed at least that much for this stage, and any extra ones is just gravy. So we're going to do a little bit of a puzzle skip here. So normally you're intended to punch the derrick on the left to change the polarity of these. But it turns out if you backwards roll into this, you can kind of stand in the electricity. That allows us to hit this puzzle trigger on the far end. So we can bypass that section of the level pretty efficiently. Gonna get a little bit more magic here so that we don't need to fill it up later. So we need to do a precise jump to get on top of this breakable wall. And then we're going to have to do a precise jump to get out of bounds towards the rear of the screen here, near where the green test tubes were. The problem with this, and we're going to see this here, is that there is very little space to stand on the outside of the stage here. I was doing a little bit of experimentation here, so it's a little bit of my fault that I fell out of bounds here. But unfortunately, I moved a little bit too far and fell out. I was constantly wondering to myself, like, is there more space than I need there? Like, can I just use sprint? But with this experiment, I actually found out that no, you need to move very slowly there and just hug the wall. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. So this was a very difficult skip to learn, mainly because of how the camera changes sometimes. Also, the small ledges that I mentioned all around the stage that lead to infinite falls. We're going to use that same backwards roll to roll into this lightning trap. That's going to allow us to grab the critical item inside the middle of that square, which is a red lens. That opens up the end of level trigger. And after we pick it up, we have to very quickly get into that trigger. If we didn't get into that trigger fast enough, we would trigger the boss fight, and the game would spawn us inside the boss arena. This is another relatively fast stage. This is Chromatic Observatory. This is going to be a good use of the guillotine trick that I had mentioned previously. We are going to use guillotine in order to catch a piece of geometry here that allows us to restand and relaunch in the air. I have worked pretty heavily on making this a safe skip. When you get on the other side of this door, there's a heavy possibility that you end up falling out of bounds. I actually get kind of poor luck here. I do a landslide punch extend here in order to try to get a standing state to finish the skip. But what ends up happening is there's a very, very slim space between the door and the trigger for the end of level. And I actually end up slamming in between it there. I'll be doing that again here. That's relatively uncommon. And the fact that I got it twice is unfortunate, but not out of the realm of possibility. I'm constantly being shown things about this game. Constant good and bad things. Sometimes I'm like, wow, I didn't know that I could do this skip that way. And I can go, wow, I didn't know that this skip could fail that way. At this point, since I failed it a couple times, I forego absorbing magic here to make the next fight faster. Because at this point, I just want to get this skip dealt with. By initiating that standing state allows me to double jump there. Otherwise, it could be kind of annoying to get from on top of the arch into this room. So the dolls here, you need to kill them with a command throw. If you don't do so, then they just respawn. One of the nice advantages of that is they spawn neutral elemental orbs, and when you kill them with the command throw, it gives you an influx of dark magic. So this is a relatively easy fight to do. It is unfortunate that you have to kill them with command grabs. Otherwise, in New Game Plus, for example, we could just break a Dark Crystal and kill all of them instantly. But that does not work here. So even though that we've been able to kind of dominate certain sections of this game with double jump, we are very quickly approaching the point where we would normally acquire double jump in the game. You receive it from the Vampire Dark Lord at the end of the next chapter. So at that point, we're going to have to get a little bit more creative with how we do skips. A little bit of breaking there at the end since it cost me no time. It can potentially get me access to a little bit more resources.
Curious, isn't it?
So Outer Wall has a couple of interesting skips involved in it. A little bit of a platforming skip here by grabbing on to the grapple point earlier than intended. Normally you're intended to kind of climb around that section and then activate it. At the top of this, we're going to run into an arena gate. Normally, you are meant to fight the enemies in there and then solve a elemental lock puzzle at the top. Alternatively, if you knew what the puzzle solution was and had enough fairies, you could distract enemies until you could activate all the locks and beat it that way. But it's considerably faster to just use a couple of holy waters. So unfortunately we get another bad kind of slope here, and it doesn't let us over. That is totally doable with 2 Holy Waters, as I prove right here. It is even somewhat possible with a single Holy Water, but that's really inconsistent, so I try to use 2 there when I can. So we have some imps that are going to be here guarding this switch. This is a big reason why we need a bunch of fairies left over. If we didn't, we would have to clear them with shadow daggers. 5 fairies is still a little bit questionable. Unfortunately, instead of grabbing the lever here, Gabriel decides to do his long-range throw, which is pretty frustrating. But luckily after that, we get the skip just fine. That allows us to not kill those imps and then enter the gate. Here we're going to break some items to get some resources. We're going to be doing the Holy Cross Breakout. So Holy Cross is a move using light magic. When you're in this move, you can actually do a breakout of animations. That allows us to grab this key and exit the room. If we didn't do the Holy Cross Breakout, then we would get locked in this room and have to fight some enemies, and then crank that lever in order to leave it. Breakouts are a pretty universal term inside of this style of game. It basically just means breaking out of a pre-canned animation. So normally Gabriel is supposed to bend over, he's supposed to pick up the key, look at it, go ooh ah, and then the gate closes. But since we use Holy Cross to break out of that animation, we can leave it and progress. A little bit of ice skating up this chain. There is a very resource-intensive skip inside of this room that would allow you to bypass this gate with a really high jump. Basically not applicable for this category, though. And it would only save a small amount of time. This is the clock tower. We're going to bypass the entire first floor here by jumping over this section. That is actually doable with just Cyclone Boots and not double jump. We're then going to crank this platform up to the second floor. The idea is to take this elevator / platform to the top floor and then ride it up to Olrox, who guards the final part of the castle. Unfortunately, in order to spawn the end of level trigger, this does need to get brought to the top. If we had exceptional resources, like full power, we could use ultimate light in order to kind of whirly-bird over these balance platforms, and then jump across the gap to the upper right and bypass this puzzle right here. That's kind of a precise skip, but it is doable with a little bit of holy water. It saves maybe like 10-12 seconds. Since we preserved our double jump here, we can actually use our double jump off of this platform in order to hit the midpoint of this jumping section. And then just jump over there. We're going to skip the next half of this floor by jumping across this gap and then high jumping. By high jumping here, we activate a grapple point that's out of view at that point, and we can get up to this place. So if this was full power, I could go for a skip against Frankenstein's monster here. This is normally the second time you fight him. Since we don't have full power and we need as much holy water as we can get, I'm actually just going to take this fight. If you wanted to go for the skip, you would have to lead Frankenstein's monster around in a circle around the crank so that it follows you but never hits you. After that, you would need to do a precise and taxing holy water backwards long jump over an invisible wall in order to hit the end of level trigger. It's really luck based because there's a number of moves that Frankenstein's monster can do to stop your high jump. If he does his telekinesis move, where he commands a bunch of kind of scrap around him, he can throw those as you're attempting to high jump and really mess up your rhythm and waste your time. So this is the much safer strat. If you can do the skip, it's super awesome. If not, you're only losing like 30 seconds or so. So again, some of these skips are very much about gambling with your resources. And this is already a hard enough game. So we're going to be doing Olrox, which is going to be a full level skip. The difficulty of skipping this boss is since the camera is action oriented, it is sometimes likely that Olrox will run all over the place and completely screw up your inputs by changing the camera on you, which is quite frustrating. This might actually be the hardest skip in the game. To like do consistently and figure it out, it took me a really long time to do this. You might hear me say this 4 or 5 times that it's the hardest skip in the game, and that should really show you just how many times I've had difficulty learning different things. So because I had already spent a fair amount of holy water on there, and I missed jumping on top of the door, I did a restart. That way I could bring back my holy water to where it was at before the attempts. So we use a holy water to do a precise jump on top of this chain. That gives us the additional height we need in order to bypass the door behind us. After that, there's actually a fairly thin trigger area in order to trigger the end of the level. So what we do is we slide against here to get a standing state. That gives us back our double jump, and that allows us to do a double jump backwards to hit the end of level trigger. Sometimes you can kind of skim the side of it, like you don't land on top of that tunnel, but you'll slide against the side of it. And that's actually a pretty good way of doing it as well. It's not quite as safe as getting the restand, but I'll take either one, especially for how difficult that trick is. So we're going to be coming up to the Vampire Dark Lord. This is going to be very basic combat, using Holy Water to get rid of vampires, then using Dark Crystal and Ultimate Light and Ultimate Shadow to dominate the rest of the boss fight. So, kind of wanted to revisit something I talked about a few minutes ago. There's a lot to talk about in this game, for skips-wise. But I remember when I was first learning this game, this was before backwards long jumping had kind of become discovered. But I remember Akion, who's a well-known glitch hunter and speedrunner for 3D action games. He came into my chat and he's like, wow, somebody is learning this, that's super cool. And I was like, yeah, I'm having a really hard time learning certain things. And he was basically like, yeah, this game's really hard. You picked a really rough game to start on. Like other games like God of War series and some of the other 3D action games, they aren't necessarily easy. But this is definitely among the harder games to learn how to do and to accomplish a strong run. It's become considerably easier over time, but it is still rough. And I'm just glad to have gained access to people to be able to like get resources like Fiddlestick and Satvara and Vipiazone a little bit as well, who does more work on Lords of Shadow 2, but he's done a little bit on this game as well. And then Akion and Fiddlestick for maintaining the glitch guide on GameFAQs as well. So this is going to be another QTE-laden action scene here. This is another one of those things that you don't want to mess up, because messing up a QTE here can cost you like 2 minutes. So, very important to play this correctly and pay attention. Gabo Belmont is the strongest. So, like, this is one of those cases where you do actually get to see some of the cool fight animations inside of it. Just kind of nice. It's always nice to have a little bit of a breather and be able to show off just how good this game actually looks. It's a shame that encoding the way it is kind of messes up this game because of the snow and rain at certain places, but it still looks really good. So going forward at this point, as I mentioned, the game does expect us to have double jump. So some of the skips become a little bit more difficult or will require more resources to accomplish as we move forward. But there's still a lot of really, really solid stuff here. And as mentioned, I've done my best to try and optimize the amount of resources needed for any particular level. As for the other runner of this game, Lestat Vampire, he has not revisited this game in quite some time, but I've seen him here and there in chat. So it will be pretty cool if he does revisit the game at some point, because I'd love to see what he's able to come up with. Maybe I've overlooked something here or there. It's always nice to have extra eyes on a game. So I did end up using the Dark Crystal on that stage. In retrospect, I probably should have saved the Dark Crystal for this stage, and I'll kind of get into that. There is a Chupacabra in this stage that would take away your relics. Doing his area takes, I think, between 1 minute 30 and 2 minutes, depending on how things develop. Slight platforming skip here. It messes up a couple times, so the funny thing is I decide to go for the harder skip, which is just jumping to this platform. So we're going to come up to an arena here, and I'm going to defeat it. The reason for that is by doing this arena, we create a checkpoint here, which is closer to the Chupacabra. If I had the Dark Crystal, I could just use the Dark Crystal and kill them instantly, but instead I have to end up kind of killing these guys as a result. In retrospect, I should have just spent extra resources on Carmella and then used the Dark Crystal here. But, you know, hindsight's always 20/20. And this was kind of a newer strat that I developed for this. Luckily, Ultimate Shadow does a pretty decent job of putting these guys in a killable state, so it wasn't too bad. So if you fail the Chupacabra skip, you're supposed to chase the Chupacabra through a cave, defeat a giant troll, and use that to break some barriers before you can get to him. And then you have to backtrack all the way to the main path. By doing the Chupacabra skip, you can stop that. And what getting the checkpoint there does is if you fail it, you can always restart from checkpoint, do a small run back, and try again. If I didn't get that checkpoint, it would start me at the beginning of the level, which is pretty serious. You'd only get like one extra attempt in that case. So here, we use a double holy water, backwards long jump, and then use landslide punch. Landslide punch allows us to get in a standing state, which will let us get our double jump back and get back in bounds. It's a little bit of a rougher thing than you might think, because there is a slope there when you get out of bounds, and if you don't get that standing state and then double jump out, you will slide back into the trigger, which is pretty frustrating. We've seen a lot of avalanche punch, which is the punch that kind of Gabriel punches down and then kind of raises a little bit. That also gets you a fair amount of height. Landslide punch kind of slams Gabriel down in the ground at an angle, but it does have some applications. During that landslide punch, Gabriel moves slightly backwards before slamming down. So what you can do is you can use that slight backwards motion and then turn Gabriel around. So what you do is you face Gabriel's back to where you want to go. He moves backward, you turn around, and then he slams down. This can give you a little bit of extra positioning that you need horizontally. It's also a little bit rough because if you miss it, he will slam down. Like, there's no more that you can do during that jump sequence. This is Woesmore. This is probably my second favorite level in the game. Once again, it shows kind of an outlook in the game design of this game. I'm going to do a restart here because it's very quick to restart this level. And again, I want to preserve holy water as much as I can, especially going into the late game. So this is doable with 2 holy waters, but 3 makes it just consistent. So I opt for the 3 there. So these keys are underneath the stage. Normally you're supposed to spawn some sub-bosses, and when you defeat the sub-bosses, the keys spawn. But the keys exist in the level underneath it before there. So by getting out of bounds, all of this space has collision at the bottom that you can stand on. So you can pick up all of the keys without defeating the bosses, and then restart from checkpoint to get back in bounds. And what's really cool about that is, again, it shows like a little bit of insight into how they designed the game. Like, the keys still exist, it's just they're in a place where the player would never be able to normally get to them, which is super cool. When it comes to patching out glitches in games, I'm a firm believer that glitches should only be patched out if they impact the casual experience in a game-breaking way. And a lot of the stuffs that speedrunners do are far from casual. So it's like, why even patch it, you know? I tried to do a high jump there because there was a recent discovery of a cutscene skip for that flow or flock of crows. I need to study it a little bit more, but I thought I'd give it a shot there to see if I could get it. This is the music box. This is a semi-auto scroller section. What you're doing is you're inserting music cylinders. The color of the cylinder indicates a certain trap. In this case, green is spikes, for example. Red is going to be retracting platforms. And you kind of have to piece together the cylinders in a timed way that allows you to get access to other cylinders. There are a couple skips you can do here. You could do what's called the red cylinder skip, which makes it so that if you do a really strong long jump, you don't need to have the red cylinder to pass those platforms. This is easier to do in the PlayStation version. The PC version, it's a little bit harder, so I'd rather opt to just get the reds and forgo a little bit of time. More importantly, there is a full level skip. If you jump very precisely out of bounds and use a bunch of holy water, you can get on top of the stage and then run to the goal at the end. Once you run to the goal at the end, you have to grab the objective in midair. So it's a little bit difficult to do that, but getting out of bounds and getting on top of the stage is the hard part, and it's very resource intensive. The problem is I've been unable to confirm this skip on PC as of 2018 at the time of this video. I've tried it quite a few times. The PlayStation version of the game, I've been able to get out of bounds 5 times. I've gotten out of bounds 5 times, on top of the stage 2 of those 5 times, and I've completed the skip once. And this is probably in about 600 attempts, I want to say. I could definitely get better at it with time, but the point is that it's very, very difficult, and I have not been able to confirm it on PC. So because of that, we do have to do Music Box. That being said, this gives a little bit of downtime to kind of talk about stuff or catch back up on things as needed. It also has a really sweet rendition of a classic piece of Castlevania music. I get a little bit unlucky on the shadow dash there. It actually kind of stopped short. It probably hit some really weird piece of collision. And then you can kind of style and have fun if you have extra time. In classic speedrunner fashion, usually I like block to the tune of the music. Shoutouts to Mega Man community, shooting lemons to the music, and Mario 64 changing camera angles and such. But there's our blue rose for Baba. We're going to be moving on to the Titan Graveyard. Titan Graveyard has another skip that's pretty notoriously difficult near the end of it. That once again has completely been revamped with backwards long jumping. It's also been revamped with a Landslide Punch Extend. So I mentioned Landslide Punch, how it moves you slightly backwards and you can turn around and grab ledges, like get a little bit of extra space. What you can do is, as you're doing Landslide Punch, if you hold jump, you move vastly further backwards. This is what's called a Landslide Punch Extend, or an Extended Landslide Punch. This can give you a ton of extra horizontal space, actually. But it is a little bit difficult to do consistently, and you have to be cognizant of how you're moving, because since you move so much further backwards, it's easy to, as you're turning around, kind of curve your trajectory rather than heading back in a straight line. Because what's happening is you're moving backwards that whole time rather than turning as you're moving. So you get a smaller window to turn around. But it's still a very useful tactic for certain skips. Here we're going to bypass an invisible wall. Normally you're meant to kill that coffin, who then drops a key item that would move the arm to my left to create a bridge. Instead, we are going to jump on that invisible arm and continue on. Sometimes after doing that shadow charge, the game puts you in non-interactive standing state, which is pretty frustrating because then you drop in the swamp and either die or have to restart from checkpoint. We're going to go off to the side here to get a holy water cache. It's going to give us a nice influx of holy water to go into the late game here. If I had full power, I could use a property of Ultimate Light. Ultimate Light, the spinning light move, you can actually use that to go over the surface water of swamps and bypass this whole platforming section. Since I want to maintain my light magic count, and I didn't have enough magic to begin with, I hold off on that. So here we are using holy water to hit a lip on the side of this Titan. That is a much tighter jump than it might at first seem, so getting it first try is very nice. Here we are going to gain a little bit of height on a high jump, and then use a backwards long jump. Triggering that second camera angle allows us to unlock the end of game trigger. Once we've unlocked the end of level trigger, we can just walk right into it through the swamp. If you get a really nice jump, you can jump into it, but that's far less likely. This is Fire Pinnacle. Here we're going to be fighting the Silver Knight. The Silver Knight takes away our magic, and because of this, our best form of damage is to parry him and then attack back. If this was full power during this stage, when I have no magic, I could break a Dark Crystal and then do parrying, which speeds up this stage considerably. Since this is just New Game Plus, I have to resort to just chain parries. Luckily, he's relatively easy to parry most of the time, but he gives me a couple of hiccups here and there during this fight. So heading into the second phase, he gives us back our light magic, but he has light magic as well. If his light magic is active, we cannot damage him with light magic on. So ideally what we would want is for him to take off his light magic after the first combo. But, you know, he gives us a little bit of poor luck here, and it's fine. This is trying to introduce a concept which we will use in the final fight of the game, which is that same magic cannot hurt same magic. So light can't hurt light, shadow can't hurt shadow. So you have to have the opposite one. At the very end, he takes off his light, so we're able to get a little bit of ultimate light at the end. Now we have both styles of magic. We do the shadow charge just to hit him. If he switched to shadow, then we would switch to light and immediately whirly bird him, and we'd be pretty happy with that, because since he's in the corner, it would deal extra damage. Hardest QTE in the game here. It's the fastest and moves across the screen, so it can kind of mess with your eyes. There is one faster inside of the game, but we actually skip that, which is going to be 2 levels from now. This is Fire Cemetery. There's a number of small platforming skips inside of this. You're going to be seeing one right here, where we're going to skip having to climb all around that platform and around. We're going to go for a slight platforming skip to activate the ring at the far end of this gorge. We do not get it this time, unfortunately. If you don't get the skip but activate the ring, then you can just get it the second time. Since I didn't get either, I just forego it and decide to climb normally. Since then, I've done a little bit of research into this skip, and I think I found a more consistent way of doing this, although it does still fail probably about 30% of the time or so. One of the most important things inside of this game isn't necessarily getting everything first try. You would love to be able to do that, but it's about recovering when you make a mistake, or, you know, keeping yourself mentally in the game to try skips again. Here we're going to be doing a high jump to bypass a Chupacabra cutscene. That Chupacabra cutscene is kind of a laser and light puzzle, which you would use to break seals on the inner cage. We're going to be going around the side here in order to pick up a Dark Crystal. We do not actually end up using this dark crystal, I think, but it's more of a safety precaution. There are 2 places we could potentially use it, but we ended up not needing it for either of them. Small puzzle here in order to unlock the gate. So we're going to fill up our magic here. There is a magic font in the next level, but because of the checkpointing, it would be worse to get it there. Because if we fail to skip in the upcoming level, we'd have to get our magic again. This arena is kind of interesting. This is one of the places why I picked up the Dark Crystal. Normally you can use Holy Water to kill these guys in a single hit. These are the guys that come into coffins, and when they go into coffins, they turn into the tentacle monsters from Titan Graveyard. This time this guy glitches out. When those guys glitch out, you can kill them with Holy Water. That's rather uncommon. Most of the time, he will make his way into the coffin. If he does that, then breaking the Dark Crystal is the fastest way to finish that fight, which is why we pick it up. Here we're going to be doing the Gravedigger skip. This is a very, very difficult skip. It took me a long time to figure this out until I looked through an old Fiddlestick video and found a technique that worked. So the angle of that backwards long jump approaching this chimney is very, very specific. There's death collision all around it. So it's very important to hit that right angle and aim yourself appropriately. What happens is as the platforms are crumbling, if you're in a blocking state, the game counts you as standing. That allows you to do a launcher in midair as you're falling and set up for that skip. Learning that was a huge boost to my consistency with that skip. And I'm really glad that I dug through old videos to find that. So we're going into the last part of the game. Necromancer's Abyss has another one of... This is one of the most punishing skips in the game if you fail it. Sorry, not this one specifically, but the Necromancer skip that we'll see later. This is a basic puzzle skip. We are bypassing a large invisible wall to get on a bridge. Normally you need to complete a eclipse puzzle that has to do with positioning the sun and the moon in the right place to make that bridge appear. This is a small puzzle. We're basically trying to make the light trail on the circle in the background. Each of the rings of this corresponds to a direction, so it's just punching the right squares to lead the light the correct way. There is a possible skip for this, both to bypass this puzzle and to do a large skip inside of this level, but it requires the infinite jump and a fair amount of resources to do. So far I have been unable to do it on the PC version, but I'm pretty sure it's possible, just pretty difficult, as with most skips in this game. You're going to hear me qualify a lot of things with the infinite jump. The infinite jump does change certain sections of the game. Not so much that you might think in New Game Plus and Full Power, but there are a couple skips that do get benefited from it. It's just, again, at this time I have been unable to implement it to its fullest. The main application you'll see infinite jump breaking the game is in New Game Plus. Or, sorry, New Game. New Game was probably originally around a 4-hour run, but with infinite jumping, it probably could drop down to about a 2-hour, 40-minute time or so, would be my estimate. But that would require you to perfect a lot of stuff and a lot of the intricacies of infinite jumping and the collision involved with that. This platform's on a little bit of a cycle, so as long as you do the first section relatively quickly, you'll catch this first cycle without much issue. These platforms, you can jump across them without much issue. Just gotta kind of plan your jumps and see where the platforms are going. I break this to try to get an additional holy water. This 5 holy water is kind of what I'll need for the rest of the game. I need 1 more for a safety strat on the next stage, so that's why I'm going to try to get an additional one. This section right here is Necromancer Skip. You could technically do Necromancer skip with 0 holy water. But in order to make it easier and more consistent to get on top of this fence, you need 2 holy water. So 2 holy water, and you need to do this 2 times, so you need 4 holy water to do this trick consistently. I wait on top here a moment to wait for him to attack, and then jump out of bounds to this place. This switch activates a portal on the other side of that gate. So now we have to get back over that gate and enter it. You'll notice that the camera panned up to the Necromancer there. He's doing his zombie summon spell. When he does that zombie summon spell for the first time, it locks your controller inputs. So the reason I was waiting on top of the gate before I jumped was if he decided to do his zombie summon while I was in mid-jump, it would completely destroy my inputs, and chances are I would not have landed inbounds where I wanted to be. So I had to forego a little bit of time there in order to give myself the best chance at making this jump. In the Californiathon run, the Calithon run, I unfortunately had kind of poor luck with this skip, so I had to take an alternative method of completing it. I still was underestimated by a fair amount as well, though. So you might be noticing that the estimate is fairly generous for this game, considering the times that I'm pushing in both New Game Plus and Full Power. The reason for that is, as I mentioned, this game is difficult, and sometimes it can take a few tries to get certain skips to work, or sometimes you have to take an alternate approach to a skip because of certain triggers you've hit or didn't hit. In addition to that, if you wanted to watch the ending, I believe it's like a 7-minute ending to the game, but I think it's a pretty nice ending, personally. That doesn't include the epilogue, but the epilogue's kind of irrelevant, so it doesn't have a nice message like the original ending does. So once again, I'm trying to break a little bit to get some extra holy water. I actually managed to get 2 holy water there, which is exactly what I needed. You want to have 3 holy water going into the Dracolich fight. If you could get 5, that would be awesome. That gives you 2 attempts per restart at attempting this glitch. However, most of the time on a second attempt, there will be other implications and factors that make it much more difficult, or possibly stop you from doing the skip. So we do want 3, though. A little bit of a platforming skip there to reach the hook, instead of climbing all over the place. So Dracolich is going to happen relatively quickly, so I'll cover some of the stuff during this. Dracolich is the final Titan. If you knew how to do the stage, and you got reasonable luck, it is something like a 6.5 minute to 7-minute fight. It's a really long fight. It involves climbing all over the Dracolich, breaking ruins and seals, dealing with shakes, dealing with cycles on platforms, all of this crazy stuff. We are going to bypass that pretty heavily. It's going to involve triggering the final stage of the boss by jumping into a platform. The platform exists during the first phase of the fight. It's just blocked off by an invisible wall and a huge chasm. Funny enough, that huge invisible wall is what is going to allow us to make it over to the other platform and initiate the final scene. So finishing up Necromancer's Abyss. A little bit of the lighting is a little messed up in this stage as well, which is kind of funny. And that's a result of not doing the eclipse puzzle. So the lighting of the sun and the moon is not in the right place. It doesn't really change the stage lighting too much, but you don't have the presence of the eclipse in the background in certain shots that you normally would. So Dracolich skip, which I consider to be probably the most notorious skip in the game, just because it skips the entire Titan, and this is a really long fight normally. We're going to use a controlled high jump using 2 holy waters to gain horizontal space. The amount of horizontal space that we get from these 2 holy waters is very important. The reason for that is that little bit of space that we move is going to put us at a specific place on top of the invisible wall. When you shadow charge off of the very edge of a cliff, you get massive momentum moving forward. And depending on what trajectory you get, you can sink very quickly. So what happened there is I did the shadow charge off of the edge of the cliff to get a huge amount of horizontal momentum. During that charge, I'm considered to be in a standing state. Since I'm in a standing state, I can relaunch off of that and then throw the holy water. The reason I throw the holy water is that gives me enough time to deactivate shadow magic. That allows me to avalanche punch and set up for a backwards long jump. If you get a good enough shadow charge, you can actually just charge right into the checkpoint for the last stage. But since that's kind of inconsistent, we save the third holy water to do the backup strat, which is to get a little bit of extra positioning from the backwards long jump. This is Satan. I am not kidding. We are literally fighting Satan as the final boss. You get past these rings by changing into the right polarity, either light or shadow to bypass it. A little bit of divine fisticuffs here. Just fist fighting Satan. Don't worry about it. So I mentioned that there's 2 skips I've been unable to confirm on PC. One of them is the music box skip. Another one is a skip involving Satan where you can potentially use a dark crystal while grabbing him for these cutscenes to skip these cutscenes. I've been able to get it to work twice on PS3. I have been unable to get it to work at all on PC, so I'm not sure if it was patched out or not. Or maybe just prohibitively difficult due to the higher frame rate on PC. But those would be the 2 major skips that I have been unable to confirm on PC. So once again, we need to use the opposite polarity that Satan chooses. We're hoping that he changes to blue, so we can drag him to a corner with Ultimate Shadow, and then we're hoping he switches to red so that we can use Ultimate Light. It's not that huge of a deal if he doesn't. Just a little bit of suboptimal stuff, but you got to deal with what the game gives you. So this time the rings are a lot more scattered, so now it's a little bit of pathfinding to figure out how to get to them. But that's the final big thing of the game. Now it's just don't fail the QTEs. Time is on the final QTE being executed, which will be the QTE after the one where he kicks him out of the ground. So big shout outs once again to Findlestick, Akion, Satvara, and Vipiazone for their work on this game, and all of the other people who have done contributions to Lords of Shadow 1 and the Lords of Shadow series in general. This has been Turbodog702. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this. Hopefully you enjoyed my commentary. And I hope to be playing Lords of Shadow in a major marathon near you. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of the cutscene.
Take your hands off me, murderer. Your soul is damned. I ask forgiveness and mercy for those that I have wronged. What I did unknowingly. Yet I would change everything if I could. He isn't listening, Gabriel. Your fate is fixed. Every man has the power to repent. I have faith in that. Forgive me. Forgive me, my God. I will have such fun with your Marie. I will introduce her to such pleasures. Her soul will go only to him. Once I have finished with you, Angel. Why has my life been given back to me?
It is your fate. You have been given back what was wrongfully taken from you. To repent your sins, to make amends.
But without you,
You freed them all. You saved us all, my Gabriel.
I couldn't save you.
I knew I could not tell you, or despair would have eroded your resolve and everything would have been lost. I had faith in you, hoped that you would be strong enough to free the world, and you did not let me down.
I am not worthy of your faith, your love. I am nothing.
You are a good man, Gabriel. You are as God intended, fallible, yet capable of great things. I loved you then, as I love you now. I see before me a man who has regained God's favor, and who has my forgiveness, and the forgiveness of all the lost souls of this world. You have saved us all, and you have saved yourself. The mask is a powerful device. It allows us to see through God's eyes.
Can it really bring the dead back?
Yes. Look.
Fool's hope.
It is too late for me, my love. I cannot come back.
No. No, don't go.
It is my time. The light is calling. I'm not
No.
afraid.
Please, stay. Stay with me.
It's beautiful, Gabriel. So beautiful. It's calling to me. Calling.
I love you, Maria. I love you. Forgive me.
Thank you for watching. See you another time.